So I was presenting some work I've been doing with Professor Tony Heron at the University of York, which is looking at the underperformance of Brexit, focusing on the UK's independent trade policy following Brexit. And so our argument was tackling the puzzle of why, despite the fact that the UK government is making a lot of hay of the fact that, you know, it's got this new trade policy competence, in actual fact, when it comes to the actual substance of trade policy thus far, there's actually not been very much in terms of new trade policy or in terms of ambition. And so our argument is that actually, you know, what an independent trade policy allows the UK government to do is through this layered performance of trade policy as both, you know, what we call a, you know, following, you know, Austin, a self-enacting speech act, right? You know, Brexit allows the UK to have an independent trade policy, and this can be performed, you know, in its negotiations with the EU, for example, or by taking up an independent seat at the WTO. What this allows the UK government to say is effectively, you know, that it can effectively smooth over tensions that exist between, you know, advocates of Brexit that, you know, are much more sort of nativist or nationalist, and, you know, advocates of Brexit, you know, who have been much more in favor of a liberal trade policy. So there's this Austinian performativity, right? You know, trade policy, by virtue of the UK having an independent trade policy, it's delivering on the so-called sovereignty dividend of Brexit, but also trade policy allows the UK government to repeatedly perform sovereignty, you know, without necessarily having to make painful trade-offs, because it can engage in sort of controversial negotiations, for example, with the United States, you know, without actually having to agree to anything, and still claim, you know, the benefits of an independent trade policy. And so effectively, you know, trade policy becomes a sort of means rather than an end. So that was effectively the gist of today's seminar presentation. So, you know, what we're trying to do here, of course, is, you know, build on existing constructivist studies of the Brexit referendum, which I think, you know, provide us, you know, some insight into, you know, how, you know, the Brexit campaign, for example, was able to sort of, you know, manage these tensions between, you know, as I was saying earlier, nationalist and globalist projects by, you know, being ambiguous and talking about sovereignty. But of course, you know, a referendum campaign isn't the same as a set of government policies. And so, you know, what our paper allows us to do is sort of take that debate forward and understand why, despite all this bombastic rhetoric, you know, actually the UK government, you know, hasn't been, you know, that ambitious. And so, you know, this is, of course, applying ideas of performativity, which, you know, have been developed, for example, in the international political economy literature of finance, for example, and applying that to trade policy, which I think hasn't been done before. If you look at the policy debate on, you know, UK trade policy, you know, it's focused on all the sort of possibilities that exist out there, or on the potential threats. And actually, you know, not that many people have necessarily focused on the fact that actually not a lot has been happening, you know, aside from hard Brexit, of course. And, you know, another important implication of this is, of course, you know, the question of, you know, how long this sort of underperformance, as we call it, you know, can be sustained. You know, of course, you can, you know, engage in negotiations without, you know, necessarily coming to any sort of agreement, but you know, the mere fact of having had a hard Brexit from the European Union, of course, has certain political consequences, political and economic consequences. And so, you know, on that front, you know, the thing that actually enables the UK to have an independent trade policy may, you know, eventually come to bite. You know, for example, we saw this this week that, you know, the UK government, or there's a discussion about the UK government, you know, postponing the introduction of import checks. And, you know, and I think this is prompted by a fear, you know, that, you know, it faces potentially empty supermarket shelves. So, you know, I think, you know, this performative dimension, I think, is quite important going forward to understanding, you know, how the politics of Brexit plays out, and to what extent, you know, that sort of that grievance politics of Brexit, you know, could be sustained. Well, you know, first of all, I need to, with Tony, write the book that's related to this research project. But one other thing I'm researching with a colleague in Malmö, Michael Strange, we've been doing a lot of work on the contestation of EU trade policy, in particular, focusing on the role of municipal government. So one thing that hasn't been remarked very much, so there's quite a lot of discussion about how, for example, you know, EU trade policies become increasingly politicized, particularly in the wake of the EU-US transatlantic trade and investment partnership negotiations. But what's been less discussed is how one important element of that politicization, and a lot of the focus of the civil society groups involved in politicizing that agreement, has been to pressure municipalities into passing critical motions on the agreement. So, you know, we've done a bit of work on that, and what we're interested in is to see, you know, more generally how, you know, the campaign, you know, the campaigns on trade agreements have developed since the sort of high point with TTIP, particularly in the sort of, you know, post-COVID, post-Brexit context. Insofar as, of course, with COVID, you know, obviously you've seen, you know, a continued sort of, you know, emphasis, at least at the European level, I think, on trade liberalization. And, you know, obviously with Brexit, you know, the sort of European civil society networks have lost, you know, their UK members, and, you know, the UK members of those networks were quite influential. So, yeah, I think, you know, following on from our work on municipalities and civil society groups, we kind of want to explore, you know, where, you know, the sort of, you know, campaigning on trade policy has gone since TTIP during this sort of, you know, perhaps lull. And one sort of very contentious agreement in this context is the EU-Mercosur negotiations. But, you know, we haven't yet seen the sort of same level of mobilization around that as we have around TTIP. So, yeah, that's the other sort of project that I'm working on